Three. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is.
Rianne Subijanto. I am an associate professor of communication studies at Baruch College, City University of New York.
Prof, thank you so much for being with us today. You've got a hazy background. It's one of those things where all the focus is on the person. I can't see what's behind you really. I can see something green that might be a map. Now, okay. Wow, you've let me in on secrets. No maps, geometrical shapes
Yes.
of
It's
different
actually
numbers.
a favorite room in my house. Everybody loves this room because
It,
of the wall.
it looks great. Anyhow, thank you for sharing that. Of course, because I'm not wearing concealer, this is just going to be eventually an audio file, so the audience won't see it. But I recommend going to the prof's house if she ever invites you in order to see this room and its great colors and shapes.
Mm.
I wanted to start by asking what's currently dynamizing, preoccupying, interesting, impeding you. What's going on?
What's going on? So, if you are in a book publishing world, you know that my is just out this year, but that actually means that I finished writing it a couple years ago. So, in the past in the past 2 years, I've been occupied with thinking about trees, studying trees and how trees can expand or expand media studies or help us ask different questions in media. And what are these trees? So I have been occupied with actually the first time that I ran into this idea of tree is as I was expanding my media studies repertoire, I started to be interested in environmental media. One of the books that I read was your book and Rick Maxwell's book. Greening media, and I thought that I have been teaching a new course in my campus in the past 2 years on environmental media, and I came across this term. Not this term, this tree called gutta percha. Every time somebody talk about telegraphy, which is the ancestor of the internet, right? And so I didn't realize that gutta percha was actually native to uh, the Malay world, which is Indonesia, which is my empirical world essentially. And so I have been studying Gutta Percha and how it actually enables for the first time global telecommunication. So global telecommunication could not be possible without Gutta Percha. But beyond that history of triumph and progress and discovery, there is a story of environmental destruction. It's the so-called the Victorian disaster, environmental disaster. John Tully said it. And so I've been thinking about this tree, and then another tree comes up, which is another palm tree that is used to produce manuscript in the Indies in Indonesia. Up until today it's still used in Bali, but it has been used since the 5th century. So I am curious of comparing these two trees and thinking about the use, the extraction, the governance of its uses, and how they reveal two different regimes through different logic of media production.
Fascinating. And of course, imperialism is an important part of that, I imagine, right? Both in terms of the British and telecommunications and the Dutch in terms of their specific control of Indonesia at different points. Would that be
Yes.
fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, now I've been reading a lot about medieval Indonesia, which is really interesting because a lot of our knowledge about Indonesia is, and obviously it's also restricted by the documents that we have, is post when European has landed in the area. But
Right.
before, in the pre-Columbian era, I know Columbus didn't go there, but we like to use that that chronology, that timeline. In the pre-Columbian, there was already a rich, obviously, exchange and trades and also the use of this palm script, lontar manuscript or palm tree manuscript. And so imperialism was one of the key strand in this study that I'm doing. Also, but also
Hmm.
community-based media production. So the two trees tell very contrasting story. On the one hand, the palm manuscript is global. If you think about global telecommunication in terms of connection and exchanges, it is global. It was used as far as the subcontinent, Indian subcontinents, to Nepal, to Tibet, to Indonesia. And the technique of producing this lontar or the palm manuscript was exchanged, in a very democratic way.
Hmm.
However, the tools or the resources to produce them are very much local, have been local. Now, compare that with telegraphy, in which the knowledge of creating this telecommunication technology is very much monopolized by the West, in this case, the British. But then the resources to create it are very much, taken globally from different places. So the knowledge of using it is patented and it's monopolized in one place, and the use of even of the technology is monopolized, but the resources are taken, extracted from different parts of the world.
I remember in the 1990s, if you were in Bangladesh and you wanted to call someone on the telephone in Pakistan, your call was routed through London.
Right, exactly. And this is why in World War II, okay, this will connect them to my book, because in World War II, because the Dutch actually d- did not have their own telegraphic line. It's called the Red Line. It's called the one that belongs to the British, and the Dutch use British Red Line, obviously, because they didn't have their own technology of telegraphy. So during World War One, the Dutch was cut off from its colonies because it was prioritized for British needs. And because they got cut off, a lot of these nationalist movements and organizations were mushrooming in the first few years of the 1900s.
And this definitely brings me to ask you about the book. I've not read it, but I've read some of your articles. Obviously, as you well know, when you live in the global south, you just don't have the same access to these
No.
materials.
Mhm.
But I've read maybe a couple of articles that are probably adjacent to the book. So could you enlighten me and perhaps some other listeners about communication against capital, which I think is the new book? And I think you've got another one coming out next year, according to your webpage at school. So communication against capital, can you take us through the volume?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So this book started in 2012 when
Oh, it's almost as old as I am.
13 years old. Come on, Toby. It's not that that old. I'm joking. But 2012 was when I sat there and did my com exam and I became ABD, and that was the beginning of this book. Um, and at the time, so I was trained in, so I guess I'm taking you to a much longer story of what
Oh,
communication against capital is. But
please.
at the time I was trained, my PhD was from the University of Colorado Boulder. And at the time I took a certificate in critical theory, which is basically Marxism. Marxist theory. And so at the time I was asking, I grew up in Indonesia where communism, Marxism, socialism has been banned since 1965. I'm sure you and the listeners know that there was this massacre of a lot of communists Joshua Oppenheimer's films, documentary, give a lot of audience in the North, global North, story about this. So they figured they knew about this. Anyway, so I knew not, didn't know much about the history of communism actually in my own country because I grew up under the regime of Suharto, and all I knew was that communism was evil and it's bad, and they killed the generals. And so, but then when I studied Marxism, which was a very important, right? Important theory in social science and the humanities, and I had affinity to its development.
Mhm.
I was thinking, what is the history of communism in Indonesia or Marxism in Indonesia? Do we have people who study Marxism? I couldn't be the first person who study Marxism. And so I started reading in history of communism, and it was so fascinating to me, especially the early communism history of the early communism in Indonesia, which is in 1920s, in that there was this very live publication. All right, so I read these books that already, that have been published for a while, which are the canon essentially of this period. But as I was reading them, I was curious, why is it only they only talk about men? They only talk about these few male leaders, local or even international. Where were if and they claim all of this book claim that this is an important movement in that for the first time lower class Indonesians mobilized themselves in a democratic, in a struggle, anti-colonial struggle against the Dutch. But if it's popular and it's radical, where were the other people? Where were the women? What was the story of lower class people? And so that was my question when I began this journey of studying this topic. And so so this book tells a story of the early period of Indonesian communism in 1920s from the perspective of ordinary people, and how these ordinary people, including ordinary men and women and children and people of different ethnicities, and how they organized that movement through the production of what I call revolutionary communication. Now, in our field, we have this term called radical media, right? And there's already a body of work on media in social movements. I call this particular media that's produced by this movement revolutionary communication because they were intentionally, they call it revolutionary because they are anti-capitalist. And so the media themselves were organized in a more democratic way, the organization of it. So a lot of the people who were party leaders or involved in the party or union leaders, they were also printers and writers and editors. Anyway, so that's going on for a few years, all the way until I started to question. Remember this book took 13 years. So after like 5 or 6 years, I was reading this. I realized that there is something else that these people have been doing that is not being talked about. And that's where the red enlightenment comes. So in my title, Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia. Red Enlightenment here is basically what my student like to say, the vibe. Are you familiar with the term the vibe, Toby? So it's the vibe of the period. The period, and that actually put the puzzle together. It explained why they focus so much on producing media, and no longer anti-colonial struggles have been done for centuries before that. But this movement, for the first time, did anti-colonial struggle through the production of schools, of public meetings, of newspapers. You might ask why. Well, the why is because of Red Enlightenment. So Red Enlightenment is that the so-called political contingency, right? History is like that. You can't really tell what's gonna happen next, right? Everything is contingent. And what are these contingency? One is the language of the Enlightenments that have been circulating in the late 1800s all the way to 1900s, especially through the publication of this Javanese princess letters. Her name is Kartini. She was a reader of a lot of Enlightenment writers from the Dutch. She self-taught herself reading Dutch, and she used Enlightenment language. But then 1917 also, so Enlightenment language have been circulating in the region, right? Especially in urban cities. But then also in 1917, we have Russian Revolution, right? And then the spread of ideas of communism. So the marriage between communist language and discourses with Enlightenment languages is what create the Red Enlightenment, the vibe of the Red movement that I study in this book.
And in terms of 65 and the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of members of the KPI, right? Communist
PKI.
PKI,
PKI, Partai Komunis Indonesia. Yeah.
sorry, PKI. An element there obviously is the CIA and US influence. But this also marks the removal of Sukarno and his replacement by Suharto. And there's something in there too, under Sukarno, of a nationalism that wasn't Marxist, but was seen by the West, in inverted commas, as too close to socialism. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, so Sukarno grew up in during the time of this movement that I study,
Yeah.
the Red Movement of 1920s, right? In fact, his father-in-law was a leader of Sarekat Islam, the Islamic Union, one of the big parties that is a part of this United Front of the Red Movement. So Sukarno, after the first, so in 1926-27, there was a revolt of the communist revolt that then led to the banning of communism and actually the arrest of 10,000 people, up to 10,000 people, and 3,000 of them were sent to Digul, which is in Papua. It's a malaria-ridden area. It's a concentration camp. If you read Rudolf Mrazek's book, the lives of the life of camp people or something like that, it talks about this concentration camp. So anyway, Sukarno was not arrested then, and in fact he wrote a piece that called. So he observed, right? He was so young, and he observed, this thriving and lively spirit that we are witnessing in the past few decades or so in among his own people. This is anti-colonial spirit, but all of these anti-colonial spirits were rooted in different ideology. One Islam, modernist Islam, one is this idea of nationalism, and the other one is communism. So he come up with this term nasakom, nasionalisme, nasionalisme, ka, communism, and sorry, agama, which means religion, and communism. So anyway, he then founded this party, PNI, Partai Nasional Indonesia, in 1930s, and it was considered radical, too radical for the Dutch, and so he was arrested. Anyway, now fast forward a few decades later, right, in 1965. So Sukarno is a very interesting dude because toward the end of his life, right, he became very much authoritarian, if you might want to call it. So Indonesia received its independence or achieved their independence, declared formally their independence in 1945, but really practically in 1949 because the Dutch came back after World War II and then say, "What are you talking about? You're declaring independence. You're still ours. This is still ours. We're coming back." So we had the so-called military aggression, and we fought the independence revolution, the national revolution struggle. Anyway, and then so once the Dutch was ousted, basically thanks to the Americans, right, who intervened in the one of the agreement. Then the Dutch left 1949, And then we didn't have pemilu, which is election, general democratic election until 1955. So when that election happened, that's great. Like that was the first time we have election. There were multiple different parties that were involved and get a voice. 19, but it was never really stable because of, there is the Islamic side, there is the communist side, and then there is the nationalist side. Then they couldn't really come to a consensus. Every year the cabinet got dissolved. And then in 1957, the parliament got dissolved. So why? Because Sukarno then declared that the so-called guided democracy. What it means is that no parliament, it's going to be centered on the executive branch, which is the president, and it's going to be also led by his own persona as Sukarno, as this yeah, he's the independence guy, right? And he connects somehow the 1920 struggle all the way until then. So the 1965, when that happened, it was a fragile country. It was a fragile country because, and don't forget one other thing, military has also the military wing since the National Revolution. National Revolution, not military, the military people, the armies were no longer didn't have that much job, right? So that's another entity that also tried to make a sense of where they are in the nation, in this new nation, what's their place. And so anyway, so if you read John Rusa's recent book, it talks about what happened during guided democracy in terms of the strengthening of the military. Um, how is it strengthening itself? Is by penetrating local governments and putting their people there, so they become like really branching out, of within daily governments of the people at the level of regency or at the level of like villages. And then communism is another entity that has been actually gaining a lot of popular voices. They were elected, I think, number fourth or number fifth in the 55 election, and they continue to be very popular among the people. And that is scary for the anti-communist parties like Mashumi, the Islamic ones, and other anti-communist people. And the communist people were close to Sukarno. And so yes, so obviously Sukarno have been sympathetic
Mhm.
to communism and the left, and he it's not just him. A lot of Indonesian leaders at the time were also socialists at the time before communism was massacred. So communist people were massacred. So to answer your question, yes.
That's definitely a polysyllabic yes, but wonderful. Thank you. Now, getting back to the earlier period, as I said, I've not read the book, but I have read an article of yours from 2017 about the revolutionary press. And I
Yes.
guess that's from library archives that you were able to get hold of that material. Can I ask how you were able to find out about the groups historically excluded from such discussions? Women, children, workers. How were you able to find out what they were doing in the 20s?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And the reason why it's excellent is because that was actually exactly my quest for the first year when I finished my com exam, was trying to figure out where were these ordinary people's voices.
Yeah.
So for the first few months, I retrace the archival materials that the previous historians use. I look at intelligence report, government reports. I look at literatures that were published. None of them spoke about or much about, gave me much information, significant information on ordinary people until I started reading the newspapers. And the reason why I arrived in the newspapers late, even though I'm a media studies person, I was also influenced by previous historians. And one of them said that I specifically, this historian said, These are my resources came from a lot of them came from Russia, the Comintern archives. And she said specifically that I'm not using newspapers because they're biased. And at the time, I'm like, okay, yeah, they're probably biased. I won't see it. But I was a media studies person. I didn't think about it until much later. And I started reading the newspapers because I was so desperate. I'm like, let me just look at the newspapers. When I saw the newspapers, my jaw dropped. I was like, okay, this is where the peoples are. This is the story of the ordinary people. And so what I did then, I sat down for maybe 4 months reading Sinar Hindia newspapers from its first publication in 1918. It's a daily, so 1980s until 1926. Every day, I just read each one of them and take down notes because it felt like a gold mine. I'm like, oh my goodness, there is this person. She is apparently a leader, a female leader, etc., etc. So that's how I got to the newspaper. And one story that's really interesting that you probably will appreciate this is in 2021 during COVID, I lived in Berlin in Germany. And because of COVID, we could teach online, right? And so with my family. And so I live in a neighborhood called Prenzlauer Berg, which is just 1 kilometer away from Marx and Engels Forum. If you've been there, have you been to Marx and Engels Forum?
No.
So if you go to Marx and I go there every day because it's just I when I go for a run, I would pass that area. So usually I would just see, okay, that's Marx and Engels statue, and then if you go there you will see not just the statues but you will see steel walls, and in that steel walls there is engraved photos of communist movements around the world. And that's where I see a photo from my period. It's actually in my book from 1920s. Only women, about 10 women were portrayed in that photo. And so what I want to say is that there were archives already, even in Berlin, that showed that the existence of women and ordinary people, but it was not written yet at the time. So that's why my book focused on ordinary people, and use this newspapers as its main sources.
And can you tell us about the next book? Did it take 13 years or 3 years or 6 months? And give us the scoop. What's it about?
So the next book is called "The History of You're talking about the Indonesian the history of Indonesian life in the 20th century, right? So that one is a co-edited volume with two colleagues of mine, Hong Xuan Lin and Klas Tuche, all three of us. My communism, the Communist Party of Indonesia was founded on May 23rd, 1920. Yes. Was it 1923? Sorry, 1920. What am I talking? I'm trying to count 100 years from then, which is 2020. Exactly. Yes, which is 2020. So in 2020, we plan a anniversary of Indonesian communism with a couple other colleagues of ours who have been reviving the study of communism in Indonesia and Marxism in Indonesia in any period. But then COVID happened, and then we did it a year later in 2021, I believe. Was it 2021 or 2020? I can't remember. But as the outcome of that conference, to that anniversary of the centennial of the Indonesian communism, we created this volume. So what does this volume do? How is it going to be different, and what's the contribution to this? So that book is not a media studies book because it's a book about the history of the left in Indonesia in throughout the 20th century. What we're doing in that book is we would like to highlight one, we want to break away from the study or the narrative of the Indonesian left that is centered so much around Indonesian Communist Party. And we argue that the Indonesian left is much bigger than PKI and the life of PKI, because PKI was killed in 1926 and 27, killed again in 48, and killed again in 65, right? But we argue that the history of the left in Indonesia is broader than those timelines, and then that than just the PKI, the party, and that it involves different not just parties, but also different organizations that are often not considered communists, like Saminism, which is an anarchist, oftentimes described as an anarchist organization. There are also different individuals that are often seen as a splinter of communism that we think that are also, they contribute so much. So the story of sojourners, people who travel, communists who fled Indonesia after 1920s, 27, and then, but yet they produce excellent Marxist theorizing. And also there's a question of the archive and the question of women in that, women, of studying uh, Gerwani, of studying Indonesian female communists who were often portrayed as um, evil women, right? So, what does it mean for a historian to study these women in the 90s during Suharto's regime? So, we want to say that the left is much broader than that, and this it includes all of these actors that are often considered not left, or not communist. And another thing important is that the left continues to exist actually, unlike communism, which is formally have been killed and banned. The left continue to exist. And despite all of this grief and violence and story of difficult and challenging stories, they continue to exist because, and they're all united actually by one thing, which is, an anti-capitalist and a better democratic future for Indonesians despite the struggles.
Getting back to where we began and publishing,
Mhm.
it's significant that the book that's just come out is published by Cornell University Press, and the book that's coming out next year, which you were just describing, is published in Leiden,
Yes,
because Ithaca and Leiden are two of the world centers for Southeast Asian studies in general.
that's
And
correct.
that leads me to ask you what it's like studying, teaching, speaking about Indonesia in a global north setting that is, I would say, comprehensively ignorant of Indonesia. For all that it is the biggest Islamic nation, it's incredibly important economically, and
Mhm.
so on. Do you find, I mean, I've noticed in some of your writing, you have to explain lots to people
Yeah.
that you don't have
Mhm.
to do if you're writing about Britain,
Yeah.
Germany, the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Um, I must say, and I often say this to a lot of my colleagues, that even at Baruch College where I teach, I don't teach about Indonesia. I don't teach about my research. I don't teach about Indonesia and about Southeast Asia. I might include some readings about Southeast Asia, about Indonesia, but I don't teach a specific course called Southeast Asia, for instance. And exactly for that reason that you mentioned, Toby, a lot of students struggle. They don't know what it is. They don't have background knowledge about it. And so oftentimes I have to explain such basic information of, okay, Indonesia is the largest Muslim population in the world, and it is also a country where a region that have experienced European imperialism, not just one, not two, not three, not four, like most of European colonizers, probably not the Germans, have, and at some point colonize the area. So I felt like I had to explain those basic things. But also obviously there is the curriculum needs. I mean, this is and so I usually obviously prioritize the curriculum needs of the department. Um, so outside of it, so in a way, I might not answer your question directly, but in a way, do my experience that I'm explaining right now hopefully answer that question in that I find that I have two lives as an academic. My life as a researcher of Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and my life as a teacher, as a professor at Baruch College. The content are two different things. Again, I incorporate in some ways Indonesia in my teaching, but not fully. I'm not a professor of Indonesia, for instance, or of Southeast Asia. I would like to teach that if I have a chance, but I don't. Um, but it doesn't mean that it's not stimulating for me. Actually, I like these two different world of mine. In that, I because I identify as a media historian. I study history of 19th century and 20th century Indonesia, right? Um, but my teaching on electronic media, on digital media, all of them somehow rooted me back to the question of the present. So it really helps me to really, you know, um, to inform me, and also these classes continue to help me to think about the present as I also think about these historical questions that I'm dwelling with in my research. And so yes, so again, going back to your question, yes, I have to explain a lot, but when I do my research, I my intellectual community of research, they are very much aware, right? Obviously, it's a niche, and people who study Southeast Asia. I must say though, it's still very hard to find a community who work on media, history of media in Southeast Asia. And so, if anybody listen to this and work on that topic, please contact me. I'd be happy to be in touch.
You're making a challenge to conventional bourgeois global north media studies just by doing what you're doing with this set of projects and with the environmental one. And at this point, I wanted to ask you about your terrific essay about bringing transportation back into media, communication, cultural studies. It's wonderful. And it manages to make a disciplinary challenge, and Southeast Asia's there. So could you tell
Yeah.
us about it?
Yeah. So that paper I think was published, was it 2024? So I must say, as a media studies scholar, I am in my heart, I'm a media studies scholar, right? And also, I'm a Raymond Williams girl, which means that I'm very much inspired by his work, stimulated by his work. I still go back to his work even when I'm confused about certain direction, and I'm like, let me see what Williams say. Like recently I was reading about degrowth communism, for instance. I'm sure you have come across that book. Kohei Saito talk about degrowth communism. And I was like, what does Raymond Williams say about degrowth communism, or just like about in the question of environmental issues and Marxism in media, or in relation to media? And it's always useful for me to go back to his work. I feel that it really it matches the way I want to see the world. So going back, that piece in intern was it in Cultural Studies, Journal of Cultural Studies, right? European Cultural Studies. Talk about how. So I've read Raymond Williams' work from the very beginning, his early work all the way until his late work. And what's really interesting to me whenever I read his work, is that he think about communication not just in terms of uh, text or symbols and representations and media as immediately observable media as we know of today, television, radio, newspapers, but also as transportation. And in one of his book, for instance, he argued that actually transportation is was actually called communication in 19th century Britain. So he talked about the connection between and social network and transport network as communication. And that's the plea that I wrote in that, not plea, but I'm basically saying we should go back to this idea of communication in terms, and that actually probably will solve a lot of our question problems that are excluded from our conversation when we talk about media. Question of the environment, question of imperialism, um, and so and the reason why that piece was out is also because that's exactly the method that I use in my first book, Communication Against Capital. And that what's enabled me in the first chapter of the book. I lay out 18th century 18 communication, the contour of communication infrastructures in the Dutch East Indies, which is colonial Indonesia, throughout the 1800s, from the creation of the development of roads and shipping lines and railways, alongside telegraphy and newspapers, and how they all change, the social and political economic structure of the society, even including the native, as well as their social and mobility lives. And so that set up the story for the Red Movement in 1920s later on. I'm always sensitive. I mean, not always, but when I think about communication, that's what I think about. I think about not just directly observable media, but also transportation, including today, if we talk about Mars, those are all transports, rockets, and the and what is it, the robots, and all of those are and also the internet is a form of transportation. If you think about it, all of our information was transported through fiber optic cables.
And it can still rely sometimes on Malaysian rubber, amongst
Yeah,
other things.
Malaysian, what?
Rubber
What is that?
um, for the undersea chains.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Exactly. Yes.
I wanted also to ask you about a much older article of yours that I've
Mhm.
read, which introduced me to a concept I wasn't familiar with: popular piety culture.
Oh, wow.
Now, this is from 2009, and is often the case. It's possible that I read this more recently than you did.
Toby, now this feels like a comp exam.
Yes, but the special subject is you.
I know.
Can you tell us about popular piety culture
Mm,
in the past and perhaps also today?
mhm, mhm. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So 2009, that was a while ago. Popular priority culture. So that is when I did my master's degree at NYU. I worked under Arvind Rajagopal, and at the time I was still studying. So I was not interested in Marxism or communism at all at the time. This was before my Colorado time, and I was interested in Islamic soap operas that was mushrooming in the country in Indonesia after the downfall of Suharto in the early 2000s. And I was part of the audience as well. I read this TV series. But I thought it was really interesting because at the same time, politically and socially, culturally, Indonesians were becoming Islamicized. Isla it's they're becoming more pious. You'll see more and more women donning hijab, but a particular kind that is very modern and very fashionable. And so I studied this Islamic TV series for my master's thesis and come up with the term popular piety culture, which is a form of piety that was essentially marketable, profitable, and also useful for the political regime or the dominant hegemonic parties. And at the time, many of the modernists or modern, not just modernists, but PKS, they claim to be modern Islam. They are also gaining ground. They become more popular among the people. And so what I'm saying is that these all come handy together, both in terms of products, cultural products, advertisement, and cultural um, and TV series, alongside with the actual power, not power, uh, actual hard political discourses. They all come together, this process of Islamicization in the country.
And what about today? How do you see things right now in Indonesia in terms of popular piety, but also the situation of the left and the media?
Right, that's a good question. In terms of, I mean, obviously, Islam continue to be a very strong force in the country until today. A lot of, but it cannot be too strong. That's what's really interesting about Indonesia. Indonesia continue to choose people who are not necessarily in the most Islamists, for instance. They usually choose, more centrist Islamist. But now going back to how is Indonesia today? Well, we just elected an authoritarian, president who is the who used to be the son-in-law of the dictator Suharto. So we see it. I mean, I see it as a um, how do you call it? As us going back to the Suharto's regime. It's almost like we are now trying to understand what's the failure of the Reformation era. Although, in my view, the Reformation era is after the downfall of Suharto. In my view, the problem with the Reformation era is that it's a reformation in the name only, because the institutions of um, of the authoritarian institutions were not erased or were not overcome and replaced with something more democratic, including the writing of history, historical writing, institutions like museums or any educational and cultural institutions were not replaced. And then also economically, the economy was just shifted from the family and cronies of Suharto's regime to the 1% of the capitalists. So there hasn't been meaningful changes structurally in the country, and so the setback that we return now to this dictator who also use, and again talking about popular piety because that is the vibe, again the structure of feeling of Indonesia post Suharto. It's so easy to use and politicize Islam to gain popular voices. And so that's how what's his name, Prabowo, the president, his campaign used Islam, um, and also return us today. If you see, there is an attempt to rewrite Indonesian history. And Suharto, I don't know if you've heard about this, but the Suharto, the dictator, has been declared a national hero just a few weeks ago. So there is this setback in the country, absolutely.
The new order lives.
Yep. Well, it's called yes, the new order. It continues, yeah, in a different form, in
In a
different
different
phase.
guise, but there's still an oligarchy,
Yes.
there's still corruption, there's still nepotism, unlike, of course, in the United States.
Yep.
Prof, to finish things, I'd like to invite you to add anything you want. That might take the form of something we haven't discussed, your work that I've not read, or it might take the form of going over terrain we've touched on where you want to offer something more.
Right. So what is something that I'd like to add? I'm still occupied with this question of trees, absolutely, because I envision the study of these trees as my next book, monograph. And really, I appreciate your work on environmental media. They're very helpful in helping me think about different questions in the field, but also in helping me know that I'm not alone in asking all of these questions, right? I mean, I really appreciate your revisiting Capital, for instance, Marx Capital, and really unearthing concepts from there that's related to environmental media. So I'm going to, so I'm still in the next few years, I'm going to continue thinking about this question of how trees can help us in media studies ask different questions. And really, my mission, and this is not mission in terms of ideology, but really from even from the data, by shifting our focus to the materiality of media, what it means is that the resources that we use to produce this media, and also the area in which the waste of media get thrown at, which is in the global south, it actually will help us also shift media studies from its Western centric narrative to shift it to where actually this media came from, right? In again, in the beginning of electronic media, which is telegraphy, it was Malay tree Gutta Percha that made it possible for electronic media to exist. And today we can't think about the existence of the internet and cell phones, smartphones, other, your computers could not exist without the nickel, the lithium, the cobalt that we extract in the South that affected labors of the people who live there, and also the environments. And now we see that there is a flood, for instance, in Indonesia, in Sumatra, and that was directly a result of this resource extractions that were done, in a very illegal manner, and in a manner that is not um, wise, or is not thinking about the environmental effect of such a massive scale of extraction.
These are great points. I can't wait for that book to come out.
Thank you.
It's been lovely chatting to you. I deeply appreciate it, and I've gained a lot from the last hour we've spent together.
Thank you so much, Toby. Thank you for having me.